Was yours the worst computer? Because I only know that because I got on Emma, she's not here, but she's left. I got on her computer one day because I was actually in payroll. And one of her goes, wow, yours is significantly more like that's cool. I mean, it's really weird.
I still think.
All females.
Oh, really? You probably, that actually probably, like, there's a lot of people probably see what's going on, see what Harvard, what the index is working on. There are, yeah.
I'm making my own research source list of styles, but I haven't done it.
You really could.
But definitely like get broccoli color and less not
I know, I saw it. Thought of you. I should get it. Oh, really? Yeah. That's opening the base. Yeah, it's reading capture. We have Porcy now. Porcy.
I wonder if I should save Nina's seat. Looks like it's going to be hard. I could put my coat somewhere though. I can put it back there, but maybe I'll try to grab a seat for her somewhere. was actually just getting the 10, and then because of the yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. I saw her flip by there a minute ago.
Do you have a second to share I'll put this in the share text with the live video. It's easy. But I also like yeah. Wait. Okay, wait. Okay. I feel okay. Hi, you're here. Oh my gosh, hi. Wait, I need to make sure I'm deleting something else. Sorry, go ahead. It's an awesome. I usually take a lot of photos. Yeah, sure. I'll go take yeah, that's I couldn't. I just like it was crowded. It was very and I felt that if I tried to save seats more so stand-up people. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, and I don't know how easy it's going to be for me to be in a good way, but I think I can do okay from here.
I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, we're both. I don't like I know. You know, I think we're already.
Waiting for us to figure out.
Okay.
It's really a crouching area. It's also it's fine.
She's sitting here. Yeah, I think
If I hadn't done my homework and looked ahead to see if we'd actually be speaking there.
Masha, this is for you.
Oh, I don't know. Oh, yeah, I'll do it. Oh, no, it's excited.
Oh wow. Okay. Sweet.
One arm. Oh yeah, wait, no. You can't come back.
Sorry.
No, but there's a regular day where all we do is
Oh, really? Should I just send it?
I mean, there are a lot of people.
Oh,
Yeah, I can use it. I would have to tweet out.
My apologies, I think this is a problem. I've just been sick so lately. I don't think I can spare even 5 minutes before 90.
She has a photo. She has a
Hey,
What did you do with your magazine?
I gave a couple of the people who are here early copies in February, but I don't have the most recent one. They're selling, which is great. So it's perfect. And I put some of them on the table for display, but let's put the other ones. They have all the books displayed. They're out. But they have it at February.
Yeah, you just give it a sign.
Rachel?
Hello, dear.
How's it going? No, it's like something. I was here Monday, but it was pretty chill today. It's fine, but there was hot flash.
Well, was that a blessing?
Yeah, no, it's
I hear you're doing introduction.
I mean, I'm doing a micro introduction. I didn't. That wasn't.
You learned about that today.
Yeah, that was about done. I mean, my idea is to speak for 60 seconds and get out of the way. I mean, I called my wife to remind me that I need to keep aggressively flawed the magazine to the audience. She's like, don't worry, I'll make a strong case for. You know what? I think I can just finish right there because I'll just give very quickly a background on the issue of the magazine, if it's a continuation of that, if you can buy the magazine. You know, I mean, so I'll just say on the other magazine.
All right. Is there anything I can get you want to start?
No, I don't think so.
Nice to meet you.
Someday, obviously not now, I would love to have a conversation with you about water. Which is raised a few times, and I spend a lot of time thinking about it.
That would be great.
I would love that.
Well, it's nice to
Yeah, it's a pleasure to meet you, and I'm excited to hear you.
Thanks. Thank you.
for doing this.
Sure.
Oh, hi, I'm James Marcus.
Hi.
Very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet
Thanks
you.
for doing this.
Sure, no problem.
Delightful to have you in the magazine and here, so.
Sure. You go.
I'm going to make some microscopic preliminary remarks, but at the end of them, I will briefly introduce you and explain that you will be introducing everybody else.
Okay. And then just meet these guys.
Yeah, I mean, you can as But I'll just take souvenirs and then get out of the way.
Sure. And then, so we have how many habits? I don't know. One of you guys can put the time.
Yeah, there's you.
Like a tripod.
You know, I said we want like 10 to 15 minutes before the audience. We'll know how.
Just so somebody tells me what to do.
Yeah, so you don't have to worry about it. They'll still just signal you.
Okay, perfect.
Should be great.
I do prefer
Just be careful not to
You're very kind to me. Thank you.
Your service. You're in the bells and McNally minutes. It really hurts me. I was actually just curious to see if Nina was something about hanging from the rafters.
I know, this is great. I don't
Yeah, we're great. They're actually again.
we just really wanted to sit out.
They're really well organized and they have like a plan for what it. I think that as soon as I see them,
There's no service pictures like that.
They're doing the video.
Is the guy with the dark haired guy? Sorry. He has a checker shirt.
Were you talking about starting? So James told that guy that he didn't want him, he just was gonna start. James.
Okay.
So yeah, so like that guy, James told that guy that he wouldn't introduce James, because James would just get up and start.
Okay.
So whenever you guys want to start, just let James.
Cool. I just need to talk to him because the live stream.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine.
Where is that? Your seat? Maybe, yeah. Do you need it? Because I don't care.
Well, I won't want to see that. Yeah.
I'm not sure how many shots I'm going to be able to get with the crowd like this.
I'll keep lines.
Let me see.
If there's an extra seat.
I can go. Do you want to put your stuff over there? You can.
So it's gonna go well. Trick documents by midnight. Federal rule.
Not like sitting ahead. Yeah, no, I'm not. I can't get a good spot.
Yes? Miss? If there's any version of extra sweet, I would say the Andre version of anything anywhere, I would also.
Coming now, so it's already running. So I'll just check the framing.
Oh yeah, looks great.
It is.
you want to just take mine?
I hate to divide you with yours, that doesn't seem right.
I am fine with the number 4.
If you're sure that's okay, I would be incredibly grateful. I really want to be able to ask, because I'm so physically not great lately. It would be very nice.
Yeah.
Hi everybody. I think we're going to get underway. I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. My name is James Marcus. I'm the editor of Harper's Magazine. I wanted to welcome you all. I think we're going to have a very inspiring and invigorating conversation ahead of us this evening. I'm going to say just a very few words and then I will get out of the way. As many of you probably know by now, in the wake of the election, we decided to do a forum at Harper's called Trump: A Resister's Guide, which ran in our February issue. The idea, and we worked 2 months in advance, so this was much closer to the shock and pain of the election results. The idea was to bring together 11 very smart and varied contributors who would move past the initial stage of sort of grief and shocked invective and do some hard thinking about what was the best way to resist. Well, what was the best way to grapple with this in a more practical sense, moving beyond just being incredibly angry and incredibly shocked and in a state of grief. So the sort of heavy lifting editorially on this was done by Emily Cook and Giles Harvey. I think they're both here. Give them a round of applause. And they brought together and at a very high speed edited 11 really strong and really varied pieces, and we have some of those contributors here tonight to continue that conversation. I am going to say just a couple of other things and then I'll get out of your way. We actually have copies of the February issue here, which has the Resistors Guide in it. That magazine is no longer available on the newsstand, but we probably don't have enough for everybody, but they are for free, and so please feel free to take one. Our most recent issue, which features a wonderful cover story by Leslie Jamison called The March on Everywhere, which is about the Women's March in Washington, but also about the legacy of female activism, and again, very much a continuation of the questions that are posed in the forum. I want to urge you all to stampede upstairs and buy that magazine as soon as this is done. Because a magazine like Harper's is very much involved in the resistance that will be the topic of this conversation, but we really need your help too. So I hope you will seriously consider buying the newer issue. This event is being live streamed on Facebook. So if any of you have friends or acquaintances who would enjoy this conversation but were not able to make it, you could text them. I don't know if there's any service down here, but run upstairs and text them, because it will be streamed live, and I'm assuming it will be possible to watch it after the fact as well. The last thing I'm going to add is that I'm going to introduce Corey Robin, a contributor who is going to moderate the panel, and he will go on to introduce everybody else. So let me just get my notes out here. Corey is a political theorist, journalist, and professor of political science at Brooklyn College. He is the author of the book Fear, the History of the Political Idea, and also, more recently, The Reactionary Mind, Conservatism from Edmund Burke to Sarah Palin. His articles have appeared in many reviews and newspapers, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the London Review of Books, The Nation, Jacobin, and Dissent. And as I said, he will be moderating the conversation. He will be introducing our stellar panel of participants. And I'd say about 15 minutes before we're done, we will open the floor, obviously, for questions from the audience. So I thank you once again for coming, and I look forward to a great conversation. Thanks again.
So thanks, everybody. I'm going to just first introduce our panelists. On my right is Kay Crawford, who is an academic and an author and has spent 15 years studying the real-world impacts of complex technical systems. She's principal researcher at Microsoft Research, a visiting professor at MIT, and a senior research fellow at NYU. She's written for a wide range of publications from the New York Times to Nature and Foreign Policy. To the right Kate is Lawrence Jackson. Lawrence Jackson is the Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of English and History at Johns Hopkins. Jackson is the author of several histories as well as numerous essays and reviews for outlets including the Washington Post, Baltimore Magazine, New York Times Book Review, and the New England Quarterly. His forthcoming biography of Chester Himes will be published by Norton in 2017.
July.
Oh, July of 2017. Okay. To the right of Lawrence Jackson is Masha Gessen, who is a Russian and American journalist and author who has been a critic of Russian President Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Donald Trump. Her 2011 biography of Putin, Man Without a Face, was an international bestseller, and her latest book is Where the Jews Aren't. And then at the end of our panel here is Sarah Schulman, who is a novelist, nonfiction writer, playwright, screenwriter, and AIDS historian. Her most recent books are The Cosmopolitans and Conflict is Not Abuse, Overstating Harm, Community Responsibility, and the Duty of Repair. She is the Distinguished Professor at the City University of New York College of Staten Island, and a colleague of mine as well. Okay, so we're going to start. I'm going to start with a set of questions, and then later on, as we said, we're going to open it up. So we'd like to start by asking each of you about the short contributions you wrote for Harper's, or in your case, Masha, for the New York Review of Books and the New York Times, following the election. If you could tell us what did you argue in December, and how would you modify or update those views now in March? What has changed, if anything, in your thinking since then? And I'm going to start with Sarah.
Okay, so what I wrote about was looking back. I'm an AIDS historian, and I was looking back at the AIDS activist movement, particularly ACT UP. I run the ACT UP Oral History Project, which you can look at online. And they were really the last successful social movement in America. So I think it's worth looking at them to see what strategies and tactics they use that were successful that can inform us now. And then my biggest takeaway in the article was that ACT UP did not work on a consensus model. So they did not try to force each other to all do the same thing or to understand things in the same way. There was simultaneity of approach. And so I think that that is a great lesson for us. You can spend your whole life trying to change one person, and people can only be where they're at. And believe me, I wish everyone was where I'm at, but they're not. Having movements that are very flexible and recognize that people need to respond authentically from where they stand, and making space for that is really important. So that was basically my argument. In the update, it's been interesting because resistance has come from very unexpected places, like the Rockettes. People like Sally Yates. Yes, there are a few people in government who have some integrity, which is always shocking to discover. And one of the strategic things that we're seeing emerging, especially in much younger people, is a generational difference about freedom of speech. And this is very, very significant, and we're seeing it in young black people and in young white people expressed in different realms. But my generation really felt that freedom of speech was, and I believe that myself, is this very precious cornerstone, and that we all have to defend. And yet we're seeing on a lot of campuses that this primary tactic is to stop fascists from speaking. And it's very hard to argue that. So that's, so my position on that right now is that people just have to do what they have to do, and their politics are going to mature as we all interact with each other. But that is a strategic difference that I've seen emerging in the subsequent time.
So, on election night, I was actually on standby at the New York Times. I was supposed to be one of the number of writers writing about reaction to the election results around the world. And around 2 o'clock in the morning, I emailed the editor who was editing that package, and said, I think I should write something else. I'd like to write a piece on surviving autocracy. And he wrote back saying, well, maybe we should wait for the final results. And I said, I can make a provisional, but I don't think the results are going to change. He said, nah. So I sent it to the New York Review of Books, which was a fateful decision for both the New York Review of Books and me. It crashed the site several times. the Friday after it came out. But anyway, the piece was called Autocracy Rules for Survival, and it was a list of 6 rules that I felt I could sort of crystallize based on my more than 20 years of life in Russia, and especially the 13 years of living under Vladimir Putin. So those rules included rule number 1, believe the autocrat. This was, you may recall, at a time when people were saying, well, he's not really going to build the wall. That's not possible, right? So my point was, and obviously it's much more complicated than that, because it's very difficult to believe somebody who lies all the time. Right? But still, when he says things like, when he declares intentions, and when he does it repeatedly, it is very important to not disbelieve on the basis that it's irrational, right? Which is, oh, thank you. I thought there was something wrong with it. There were a number of other rules, but 2 that I would focus on right now were stay outraged and don't be taken in by small signs of normality. What I think I didn't anticipate at the time was that unlike other rulers that I've written about, including Putin but also Viktor Orban in Hungary, Trump hasn't set in motion a sort of autocratic creep. He is much faster and much more erratic, much more of a bull in a china shop than I possibly could have predicted. So the danger of being taken in by small signs of normality didn't seem to be present for a while until he managed to read from a teleprompter for a whole hour and a few minutes, and then he suddenly looked presidential. But I think if there's one thing that I've been surprised by, it's the speed with which things have been developing.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Yeah, it's great to be here tonight, and I think that for most of the rise of Donald Trump, I was living in Georgia, and I live in Baltimore, Maryland today, and I must admit that his success did not really surprise me. In fact, the thing that stands out is that I had sort of an argument that more or less ended a very long-standing friendship, and it was with someone who had served at one point as, I think, a delegate at the convention for Obama. Or I know that he attended the 2008 Democratic convention when Obama accepted the nomination. And he was absolutely convinced that it was actually impossible for Donald Trump to be successful. And that was absolutely not what I was seeing in Georgia. And, it's very interesting speaking to an audience. I mean, I'm going to call you all New Yorkers because I'm definitely not a New Yorker, right? It's very nice. I'm so happy there's such a vibrant crowd out tonight. But I must admit, from my point of view, I sort of look out or make a quick glance, it seems like a very white crowd. And it seems like, I'm in New York, so I assume it's a super elite crowd. So part of the country definitely looks like that, but it is not the entire country. And I just hope that, I suppose my update is, I'll get to the update, is that the New Yorkers and the elites among us would venture out, and especially those who have had access to the high-powered university system that exists and is now really a transnational system, especially with the European nations, and that you would take those educations and those pedigrees and go other places, and that we would see some of the clustering. And this is just work that we all have to do. I mean, I have to do the work in the classroom and with the people that I come in contact with in my social network and sphere. But what I would just keep emphasizing is that in Georgia, it seemed to me as if he had a hell of a chance. And I spent a great deal of 2016 driving back to Georgia from Maryland. It's a 10-hour drive, or typically about a 10-hour drive on Interstate 85. You go through, you're on 95 through Richmond, then at Petersburg you get 85. You go through Durham, you go through Charlotte, you go through Spartanburg, South Carolina, you get to Atlanta. And it really did seem to me to be just sort of Trump country all the way. At one point I was not bivouacking, I was backtracking from 95 over to 85 through a part of Virginia where my ancestors were from. I have a book about my dad's side of the family where we were enslaved. I know nothing about this part of rural Virginia, right? And the barn-sized rebel flags, I mean, it wasn't even so much the Trump flags, but I just had the sense that Trump had struck precisely the nerve that absolutely appealed to the gut of many Americans. What I wrote in the piece that came out in February was really having to do more with my return, and I think that over the years, over the last 20 years, I've sort of gone through my experience growing up in Reagan America, or being a teenager and young adult during the Reagan years, and I'm 10 years older than Ta-Nehisi Coates, but like Coates, we come from the same part of the same city. The absolute saturation of these narcotics markets, living in a city with a relatively small population, I mean in the neighborhood of 600 or 700,000 people, and every year in excess of 300 homicides, every year probably close to 1,000 people being shot. I mean, just, you know, gun violence that was difficult for me to comprehend. Obviously, I'm, you know, the bookish person among my friends, the bookish person from my neighborhood. But nonetheless, it touched all of our lives. And I was trying to sort of figure this out. To me, the regime that Trump and especially Steve Bannon and you know, I'm recently learning, I guess like many of us, the money behind the throne and the Mercers and the rest of these people, it seems absolutely continuous from these earlier decades. And so it's been difficult for me to make a real break. So when I got to the piece for Harper's, I wanted to write something that was affirming and uplifting and that would point towards, you know, what we could possibly do in the future. And what I found was, you know, and again, I'm returning to a city that's now actually had an uprising. Where you know, sort of young black people who are written off by, you know, not just the police and the city social services, but also by the academics, by the churches. I mean, nobody is interested really in sustained outreach, have a full-scale uprising. And in the wake of that, what could be seen were many grassroots organizations that were doing really, really powerful work. And so I tried to talk about a couple of them. One of them is Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, really phenomenal, dedicated young black people. And coming out of Baltimore, you know, we are in the spirit of Frederick Douglass. And also, I was earlier today at the Swan Gallery and looking at the image of Harriet Tubman that's been uncovered. But Tubman is, you know, Eastern Shore and also spends time in Baltimore. And so we have, you know, sort of 150 years plus of a history of really, really radical resistance. And I'm looking forward to what the young people are able to produce. I mean, again, I'm 48, I'm interested in what the people in their 20s are doing. And I think that we have a great chance. But I don't necessarily see Trump as a radically discontinuous discontinuity or break from the other regimes of power from the 1980s, and then especially for me, the moment in 2000. So.
Wonderful. So first of all, thank you all for being here. This is actually one of the things that does make me feel some optimism to see that we're still turning out to think about strategies of resistance. So in my case, when the amazing team at Harper's got in touch with me and asked me to write a piece for this issue, they said, look, Kate, we'd like to know what individuals can do with technology to resist. How can we resist with the tools that we have? So I thought to myself, well, unfortunately, we've come to a point in history where we've created something very akin to what Edward Snowden called turnkey tyranny. We have extraordinarily powerful platforms that are tracking our every move. We have essentially created the world's most powerful Muslim registry already. It's called Facebook, and what we know is that the vast majority of people will reveal their religion, often unintendedly. Basically, every time you like something, you're being tracked, and right now, we can basically predict your religious affiliations with around 82% accuracy. So what we do know at the moment is that we've created these systems that give extraordinary insight into our thoughts, our feelings, our political motivations. So what I was doing, I was thinking, well, what can we do as individuals? And I thought, well, you can use Signal, that's always a good idea. You can use Tor and have private browsing. But realistically, this is not an individual problem. This is a collective problem. And it's a problem which has become extremely difficult in the face of the concentrated power of the technology industry. So I found myself writing an open letter to the leaders of the technology sector to say, look, this is your moment to recognize your power as civic actors. However, it's somewhat of a depressing piece because, of course, if you go back through history, which is my training, you'll find some somewhat depressing stories about how technology companies have responded to autocratic regimes and fascism in the past. Of course, IBM famously basically ran the information database system for the Nazis in what was called the Hollerith machines that were basically brought to Germany in 1938 by IBM's subsidiary. They then again decided to form an extraordinary coalition to basically do the information subcontracting for Japanese internment here in the US. And we can actually go also to South Africa, a story that fewer people know about, the Book of Life, which was basically created as a way to have the most enormous electronic registry of the population, where everybody was split into one of four categories. You were black, white, coloured, or Indian. And the amount of pain that this registry caused in terms of what jobs you could get, what restaurants you could eat in, who you could marry, was an extraordinary and terrifying piece of information machinery. So in light of that, it strikes me that we have a moment where we have to put a lot of pressure on technology companies to think much harder about these questions of accountability, of their capacity to act politically. So when I wrote this piece, I was thinking, okay, I'm not wildly optimistic, but I do think this is going to come down to people on the inside being able to make some decisions, to be able to throw some sand in the gears. I kept thinking of this extraordinary story of René Camille, who was a member of the French resistance. And what he did is he was one of the few people to sabotage the Hollerith machines of the Nazis directly. He actually basically just interfered with the lever that would stamp column 11, which was the column that would indicate Jewish identity. And by doing that, he saved hundreds of thousands of lives. The difficulty now, of course, is that you can't see column 11. It's actually really difficult to understand how you intervene in these systems. And that, I think, is a lasting provocation to certainly people in my world to do more work around accountability, transparency, and ethics of these systems. Having said that, what's happened since then has been, unfortunately, true to form. We saw a set of technology CEOs ride the golden elevator up to Trump Tower and take a meeting. After that, though, we saw some interesting splits. We saw the creation of Trump's Innovation Advisory Council, where you will see again in true form the CEO of IBM. We also saw the CEO of Uber, Travis Kalanick, on that council, but he actually stepped down after huge customer complaints. So what we say and do does still matter. I think that's something really important to take from this. And what I'm also seeing now, unfortunately, is the rise of particular types of what I would call authoritarian implementations of artificial intelligence. And this is the thing that I'm now working on, to think about how we ensure that these extraordinarily powerful new technologies aren't used to further centralize power and occlude responsibility.
Great. So we have a lot of questions that we still want to ask, and I think my phone is now dying, but I think what it was telling me was that took us about 15 to 20 minutes. So I'm going to ask everybody to try to shorten our answers a bit so we can get to the audience. This is not against any particular person, but just otherwise we won't kind of get through the discussion that we want to have, I think. So, but picking up on what you just said, Kate, I think all of you have written in one way or another about questions of resistance or collaboration. What will I or will we do or not do? And so I wanted to ask you all, from your perspective, are there circumstances in which compromise makes sense, and what would a compromise even look like in the moment that we're in? Or conversely, I mean, you use the phrase throwing the sand in the gears. What are some other ways that we might think about that now? Some of you are institutions, and some of you are independent writers, but can you think about instances of collaboration or resistance in the institutions or collectivities of which you're a part? Did you want to start again on your, okay, go ahead.
Okay, so to the compromise question, I say no. And I think a really good example, just through my lens, if you just analyze where the queer movement was when Trump was elected and what's happened since, I think it's really good evidence to not compromise. Because where the queer movement and the gay movement had gone through the Obama years is that it divided basically racially into a gay rights movement that was primarily white and that participated in a kind of white reconciliation through marriage and parenting and traditional family, re-entering the white family and entering into the white power system. And this creating a new kind of adject-object, like a new queer, which would be undocumented queer people, poor queer people, refugees. So the hierarchy is still there, but it got rearranged racially. And what we started to see is that radical queer politics began to live in movements like Black Lives Matter, where 2 of the 3 originators were openly queer women, or Palestine Solidarity, which is practically the new queer movement, really, if you look at who's in it in this country. So then you see Trump. And so there's a scramble, because the constructions that we had in place to have a community-based relationship that enabled us to respond so efficiently to AIDS are not in place anymore. A lot of people are in privatized family units. The existing organizations are very conservative, like Human Rights Campaign. They don't really understand the broad issues. I think the most important gay leader in America right now is a Latino gay man, Anthony Romero, who's leading the ACLU. So it's kind of there has not been a coherent response because of that assimilationist trend.
So what I'm afraid of is actually not so much compromise as a situation in which compromise is impossible, right? And what I mean by that is one of my first books was a book about my 2 grandmothers who were still alive to be interviewed in depth. They had both lived through World War II. I mean, the subtitle of the book was How My Grandmother Survived Hitler's War and Stalin's Peace. And it was really a book about the nature of collaboration and about situations in which you exist inside a giant machine that is intent on making you a cog in itself. And no matter what you do, you cannot stay independent of that machine. And so that's my greatest fear, and that's what I think back to every time I think about compromise, because that's the most frightening situation to me, because that's a situation where judgment is impossible, right? So how do I think it is best to plan for it far in advance, and my own approach is to think hard in a situation that I consider to be normal, about things that I would never do today, and fix them for myself, and promise myself that I will not do them under other circumstances.
Can I just jump in here and maybe to frame the rest of the discussion around this? The philosopher Susan Neiman wrote this book on evil, and one of her arguments, she has many arguments there, but one of them is about the smallness of evil, that we tend, when we think about evil and these kind of terrible regimes, we tend to think about them in cataclysmic, very dramatic terms. But in fact, the steps towards it are infinitesimal, and oftentimes, from the perspective of the person who's engaging in those steps, are very difficult to recognize. And when you do recognize, the costs of transgression are very high, and it seems like the evil you're contributing is very small. And so it seems like, the better part of valor maybe to be, it just doesn't make much sense. And so I wonder if maybe we could think a little bit more, in this thing, a little bit more concretely about that, and what that might mean in this moment, if at all. Maybe it's the wrong frame of reference.
I know that sometimes I feel like my commitment to Enlightenment rationality is the major compromise that I make. So sort of already compromised. But I think that we should perhaps take more seriously humility. Many of the people that I work with and many of my neighbors, in conversation they will say, well, I went to Thanksgiving dinner, or some kind of holiday celebration, and I learned that my brother voted for Trump, or my sister-in-law voted for Trump, or my cousin voted for Trump. And so I actually don't have any family members that voted for Trump. But I think that we are failing to have the important conversation and intervention where it is actually rather close to us. And sometimes I think it's our arrogance and some of the presumptions that we make that we have the single right answer, and an unwillingness to engage people that are our nearest friends, associates, lovers, relatives. And I think that if we can incorporate perhaps a little bit of humility, I think that is what prevented many of us from seeing the possibility that he could be elected. Then I think that'll be a big part of our solution.
Yeah, I mean, I like this provocation because, of course, it just takes us straight back to Hannah Arendt every time, and the banality of evil is still with us, but that banality is sometimes very hard to detect, and it also makes me think of, speaking of the New York Review of Books, an earlier essay to yours, around 20 years prior, the extraordinary piece that Umberto Eco wrote about fascism, and this idea that fascism is always with us. It's sort of traveling with us. It rarely declares its name loudly and says, you know, I want the brown shirts to parade again in the streets. It's this much more subtle presence that we need to be fighting in a much more consistent way. So I tend to think, first of all, about resistance in this way almost as a immunological resistance. You know, what does it take? If these types of authoritarian tendencies are with us, like germs on a subway, and you're constantly having to fight them, how do you begin to increase your own resistance? How do you begin to work with others? And here I think of Sarah's essay in this amazing special issue, thinking about coalitions. How do we begin to maybe not collaborate with the inside, because frankly I don't think there is an inside game with the Trump administration, to be clear. We cannot be looking at that as a place to collaborate. But I think we can collaborate with organizations and activist groups that we might have had differences with in the past. I think that type of coalition building is something that's incredibly important now. So it's, in some cases, a different type of collaboration. We know that activist groups can get very wedded to their own way of seeing, but I think being more open and being more pluralistic there will be incredibly helpful.
Well, on that question of coalitions, that actually leads, I think, right to the next question that I wanted to ask. I think one of the big issues that people who are activists confront on the left is not just coalition with each other's, with activists on the left, but with this entity called the Democratic Party. And I'm wondering what you all think about coalition with the Democratic Party, collaboration with the Democratic Party. What sort of strategies do you think about electorally? And also for the Democratic Party itself, which is now, Trump has made, in the last couple of days, signals that he would like to cooperate with them. I mean, he's done that periodically throughout the whole thing, so it probably comes to nothing. But there's a question, on the table about that. And are there any policies with the Trump administration, or is that are we're thinking about, or is it just a no-go territory? So those are a lot of different questions. But I'm curious how you all.
Well, my view is that we can never go back to the neoliberal, unequal, dysfunctional, and exploitative society that we lived in a few months ago. And that we're going to have to come out the other end. But that means thinking about it really differently than we thought about it in the past. And I think, journalists took a while to wake up, and lawyers, thank God for them, I never thought I'd be able to say that. But the reason the Democrats have been so slow is that they think that system still exists, and it doesn't. And they relying on that structure for their status. But we're starting to see some of them peeling away from that. And if I was them, I would join the resistance so that when people are flocking to the airports, the Democratic Party should be going there. They should be following the resistance. And I think some of them are going to catch on to that, hopefully soon.
I agree with Sarah, and I think that what Sarah was just talking about is the future, which is something that we haven't heard the Democratic Party address or try to conceptualize in any way. And I think that's been a problem for a while, but it really came to the fore when we had a demagogue who always, has always appealed to an imaginary past. The only way to fight an appeal to the imaginary past is to imagine a glorious future, which is something that has been missing entirely as a potentiality in the public sphere, and that needs to be created if we're going to come out that end.
I mean, just again, to pick up on that and make it, and to attach it to a specific, right now, in the wake of the Obamacare repeal defeat, there's been an argument about the left. Should the left be pushing for, kind of Medicare for all, or should it be pushing to defend and hold on to Obamacare? And this issue that you just brought up about, the future and thinking about it, and people, have good arguments on both sides, and I'm just wondering what we think about that. I mean, is it, is the future something that maybe we can't afford right now in the face of this, trying to stop the present?
Well, I think the problem is that the present is something that we can't afford. It seems to me, and it's quite literally something we can't afford, which is part of what brought us to Trump.
And all we have is the future right now, so I think we need to work on that. I would just say quickly that I think it's, we just heard post the collapse in the healthcare vote that the Republicans don't know how to govern. I think the Democrats don't know how to resist, and they're not very good at being a resistance party. Only having lived in the US for the last 5 years, I've just been blown away at how weak the political platforms have become, anemic. We haven't learned to flex those muscles yet. So I say shoot for the moon. I'm like, absolutely Medicare for all, thank you very much. It happened in Australia, we didn't turn into a socialist republic, sadly, but just saying you can do it. It's not going to be the end of the world. It's actually more affordable than you might think. So absolutely, I'm voting for the future on that.
I think that the point that Sarah made in her essay about the value of action, that all of the collaborations that we make, but especially with the Democratic Party, should never preclude insurgent action and activity, and that if we take activity as the byword, that that is our best security, and also that it must be with the vision of the most glorious future that we can imagine, healthcare for all.
Also, I think a good framework for figuring out how to navigate is to just focus on solidarity. Who is the weakest person in the room? What is being done to them? It's your responsibility to intervene. Even if you don't have a big picture, nobody knows where this is going to go, right? We all understand that. But if we just follow our noses in states of solidarity, things like, what are they called? My campus was trying to be one of them. Sanctuaries. This, even if it's just symbolic, even if in the end Trump sends in the National Guard or whatever's going to happen, we don't know. But to make a collective statement that you are supporting, in our case, Corey and I, we have thousands of undocumented students in CUNY, and we have to make a statement of public support for them. So it's always look at who is the most vulnerable person, and that's the path.
I'm curious, do you think there's a danger of making a statement that you then can't back up with your actions? Is that a cost that we should be thinking about?
It's a wish. You just say that this is our vision.
Okay. So all of you in your writing have drawn on different histories for your various essays. Larry looked to the history of Afrocentrism. Sarah, you tonight and in your piece discussed the lessons from ACT UP. Kate, you discussed again tonight and in your piece IBM's history in the Holocaust, and Masha, you discussed Russian history and the Judenrat and other reference. So this is a more meta question, but what do you all think is the value of historical knowledge today? Are there harms to drawing too many historical lessons and analogies and parallels? Or is that not really the right question, that there's only something to be gained from it?
And again, would you just clarify harmful because it takes us away from the urgency of the present?
Well, it could mislead you. You could be invoking an analogy or a parallel from the past that's in fact not particularly helpful for understanding the present. I mean, that would be the most obvious harm. You might be not alert to changes that are actually happening in the present.
I'll go.
We don't have to go in any particular order.
I thought we had a pattern. I think that the greatest danger is failure of the imagination. I think that we suffered from failure of the imagination during the election campaign when most of us couldn't imagine, except for those of us who've really developed a strong catastrophic imagination in their lives. But most of us couldn't imagine that Trump would get elected. And I think that imagination works for the future and it works for the past. And I think that imagining history is a very important part of exercising that imagination muscle. Without imagining history, you can't imagine what might happen to us. So that's one argument that I would make. I mean, and that there are obviously dangers in sort of a runaway imagination or a misguided imagination, but basically you can't work without it. And the other point is that, as Tim Snyder wrote in a piece that was sort of a response to my 6 Rules of Autocracy, he wrote 20 Rules from History, 20 Lessons from History, which has now come out in book form called On Tyranny, and it's terrific. But he starts it with a phrase that goes something like, Americans are no wiser than the Europeans of the 1930s. I'm paraphrasing. And I would argue with that a little bit. The only advantage we possibly have is that we know what happened in the 20th century, and we know what's happened in the recent past. That's the only advantage we have as Americans living in 2017. So it would be really foolhardy to not take advantage of that advantage.
I love that. If I can riff on this idea of imagination, I also think there's something to be drawn from the imaginaries of the 20th century in terms of how we would start to deal with various forms of oppression. And here I'm thinking, I came across this extraordinary passage in Origins of Totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt. She basically describes the reason that totalitarianism didn't work enough in the 20th century, the reason why it wasn't ultimately completely successful, was that the technology sucked. They had things like the lie detector, which was a very slow, painstaking, didn't work half the time, a one-on-one technology. And then she imagines, she's like, if I could imagine a terrifying technology that would make totalitarianism absolutely impossible to defeat, it would be this map on a wall where you could see everybody, where they were, their degrees of intimacy in relation to each other, and you could track them anywhere. And she said, then you could make anybody disappear and you would never know. And it was the most extraordinary description of what I think is exactly the Palantir system that's basically being designed right now for ICE as part of mass deportations. They've just designed a huge system, Peter Thiel's backed company, which will be coming online in September. It's designed for 10,000 ICE officials to be able to access it simultaneously. It is one of the most extraordinary engines of potential deportation that this country has ever seen. And the company's called Palantir. And the reason I know this, of course, is because somebody on the inside linked these documents to The Intercept. So what's so interesting about that to me is that Hannah Arendt called it. She absolutely imagined that system, and unfortunately, that's what we have to contend with.
All I was going to say is that I think that I'm teaching a class on Frederick Douglass right now. I'm an expert in 20th century American literature and history. But I think that it's more important than at any other time to know as much as we can about the history of slavery in this country, in this city, along these streets, and that it's absolutely invaluable for us to understand precisely what the foundation of the nation state was, and how the fortunes were made, and the routes that the monies traveled. It's absolutely crucial and imperative. It means more now than at any other time.
We have key demographic groups that don't know who they are. And that's a central piece of this problem. I mean, black women voted 98% for Hillary Clinton, okay? They knew better than any other group what was happening. Black men voted 80%. I don't know what happened to that 20%. I don't really understand that vote. But white women, you know, we're troubled by this vote, right? Because historically, women have supported fascism historically. And women are supporting fascism in Europe right now. In fact, in France, they're leading fascism. And we know that in the 30s, women supported fascism. And it's very, you know, so when you're looking at this group of white women who voted against their own interests, and then you look at the group of white working class people whose jobs have been globalized by the white 1%, and how racism made it impossible for them to critique that white 1% because they identify based on racism. And instead they get manipulated into projecting their anxieties onto people who have no responsibility for their pain, immigrants. And then we have Trump telling us that immigrants cause crime. Immigrants do not cause crime, right? Street crime is caused by poverty, white-collar crime is caused by greed. You know, this has nothing to do with immigrants. So we have this problem of people who, there are large groups of people who do not understand their own place in the world. And then these are people who don't know that Obamacare and Affordable Care Act are the same thing. You know, and this is like a spiritual problem. And I don't know how to address this, but that's something that we have to grapple with in a very deep way.
So one of the most circulated pieces of advice after the election was the one, Masha, that you articulated, which is do not be taken in by small signs of normality, which have been repeated. Some people have argued that at this point normality seems to have settled in. People have gotten used to the atmosphere that we're in. And I'm curious what you make of that argument. Is there, conversely, a value to shock and surprise as a way of spurring people to take action? Just sort of reflect more on this question of normality versus surprise. Larry, you had argued that there's in fact quite a bit of continuity with the Reagan administration and so forth. I mean, I've certainly made that argument. Whenever I make any argument about continuity, people instantly feel what you're doing is normalizing. What you're saying is that, you know, this is the way it's been. So I want us to sort of grapple with this question of surprise and novelty versus, you know, sort of question of normality and normalization. In whatever way you want.
Well, I think that if there's something that we've settled into, it's actually a very frightening kind of normality. It's not the kind of normality that I expected when I wrote about it. I actually thought, I imagined more sort of what was happening in Russia for many years, which was that people were living so well. And most people were living better because, you know, just money was flowing into the country. Even poor people were living better than they had been, you know, a year earlier. That it was very difficult to simultaneously think that thought and think the thought about what was happening in the political space and how the public was disappearing, and the media were disappearing, and freedom was disappearing. That's not what's happened here. What's happened here is actually, to me, much more reminiscent of what I remember from my childhood and what I remember from my parents and my grandparents' stories, which is a constant state of low-level dread, which is a key instrument of control in all sorts of settings, including some autocracies. Not all autocracies. A lot of authoritarian countries are actually countries that depend on people feeling very well as they sit at home and disengage from anything that's public. That's not what's happening here. What's happening here is weirdly similar to what happens in totalitarian countries, where people live in the state of low-level dread, and that means that they lose the ability to plan for the future. They lose a sense of control over their lives. I have been noticing, and this is obviously anecdotal, but I've been noticing these sort of tics that are creeping into our speech where, well, if we're still talking about this next week, or if we're still around in 6 months, or if we can plan at all for what's going to happen, This is something that's familiar to me from a long time ago in a different country, and it's scaring the hell out of me.
Can I ask Masha a question?
Sure, Sarah.
Is there, so this anti-Russian thing that we're all being swept up into, is this fully legitimate in your view?
No. Okay, so the anti-Russian thing, the answer is I don't know. We don't have enough information. But I think that this game of connect the dots is an absolutely terrifying and destructive game that is helping to destroy the public sphere at a rate at which Trump would not be able to do it on his own. I think that conspiracy thinking is a crutch for the imagination. The Russia theory works beautifully. It works backwards by explaining how we got Trump, works forwards by imagining the silver bullet that's going to get him impeached once everything is exposed. There was a wonderful piece by Ivan Krustov in the Times a couple of weeks ago in which he talked about the difference between truth and secrets. And the difference between truth and secrets is that truth can be determined, but secrets can only be revealed. Every time, if we all had sort of unlimited bandwidth, it probably wouldn't do so much harm, but we don't, right? And when we're talking about the Russia conspiracy, what we're not talking about is what is actually happening in public and in our communities and in Congress and in all sorts of spaces where we actually have the opportunity to act as long as we don't give it up.
Does Rachel Maddow know you think that?
That's why I haven't been back on the show in a bit.
Sorry, I missed something on there. Oh,
Kate, please.
oh, okay. So nothing more on normalization and cost. Okay. So again, some of you have argued that, and Masha in particular, that the Trump administration's defamation of language really serves a purpose, and that it degrades the public sphere, and that in itself is something that we ought to be focusing on. And the counter argument to that that's been made by other people is that this focus on language and the garishness of the vulgarity and the aesthetics is a distraction. Something that intellectuals worry about, but in fact it's a distraction from the real business of the regime. And so I wonder what you all think about this question of language and Trump today, is it a distraction, or is it a revelation, a way in to what's going on?
Oh, I've been dove in. Excellent. So, well, look, language works. Language is extraordinarily powerful right now. We're seeing the making of a whole new epistemology of governance based on language. And not only do we go through the cycles of, is that really how Twitter is going to be used by a president? That shocking kind of use of the exclamation mark and the sad or angry or whatever he's feeling in that moment. The thing that I find interesting, though, is this language is populating into our systems of thought much more deeply than many people expect, I think. And certainly the way that I see it now shifting is it's not just human language, it's become non-human language. We're starting to see literally millions of bots that have been created to impersonate humans, that are copying the linguistic patterns of the current president. And it seems extraordinary, but they have enormous power to influence. So we are looking at these human and non-human actors drawing on these types of engagement, these systems of language to manipulate people's ways of thinking and being. And I think that's extraordinarily important, and it's new. I mean, if you think about Trump, he was somebody who became a star through reality TV, but actually he's going to go out as a past master as being a Twitter troll. He absolutely found his form. I mean, and it has summoned together like the extraordinary sort of horrors of the alt-right, as well as these bot armies. And that is something that we have to contend with. That is a new language that is has a power that we can't deny.
Can I want to ask you and all of you about that. And let's take something like the attack on the courts, which is something that I think alarmed a lot of people when Trump does this. The actual reality of the situation, apart from the tweets, is that the courts have actually been remarkably resistant against Trump. And that despite all the rhetoric and the brutality of the rhetoric about the courts, what in the end did Trump really do? He said, I'll see you in court. And he said, I'm going to appeal it to the Supreme Court all the way.
In all caps. See you in court.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when he was faced with the obstruction of the courts, said, I'm going to pack the courts. I'm going to transform this institution. And he tried to do it, and he failed. Isn't there some way that in which the rhetoric, however brutal and garish and vulgar it is actually not a path to power, but is a concealment of, in a couple of situations, a remarkable lack of power? Let's take the media as well. Ronald Reagan was far more effective, I would argue, at controlling the media than Trump has. I mean, the media has actually been tremendously oppositional under Trump. There was a book about Reagan and the media. It was called On Bended Knee, and it was quite accurate. And so, if you take these two key institutions that we associate with the preservation of the integrity of the public sphere, isn't it possible that the bark is far worse than the bite, that he actually can't or hasn't really delivered on any of these things?
I disagree, because it's taking us away from what we really care about. What were we all fixated on before this? Black Lives Matter, police violence, the killing of black people by the police. Is this in the newspaper anywhere now? Not at all. What happened? All these names that we know, Freddie Gray, and I know that that's your area of expertise. But what happened to that case? We don't know. This was in the national obsession, and it's been disappeared. So I think it's been that rhetoric is very successful.
But isn't that just the fact that he's the president? If Ted Cruz were the president, all this stuff would have probably disappeared as well. You're assigning an awful lot to the rhetoric, and I'm wondering if they control three, the elected branches of government. It tends to set the agenda. That's the way politics works. It's not the rhetoric per se.
No, because the anti-police violence movement was not created by the government. That was a popular movement that was made possible by cell phones, and it's been obscured.
I agree, and I also think that we really have to think about what we're going to end up with when we come out at the other end. There will be a time after Trump, because there's always a time after, and I think that I agree with Kate. The impact that his language is having is profound, and I'm not even rejoicing so much in how oppositional the press has been, because I'm actually quite concerned with, and this may sound very strange coming from somebody who's always identified as an activist journalist, but I think that when the national media begin to identify with the role of the opposition party, that is not a great mission to take on. Right? I think that I would much rather we identified with the role of the guardians of the public sphere, right? which would immediately make it our duty to protect language, to protect the field in which we're debating, to protect topics of debate, right, so that they don't disappear from the front pages. None of that happens when you take on the role of the opposition party, which I feel is what's happened.
I think that Trump had a master stroke when he identified the tendentiousness of some journalism, or maybe journalism generally, writing generally. I feel very strongly that there was certainly a period of time when I was, say, maybe a college student in the 1980s, and I would never have gone to an American newspaper and looked for an accurate representation of how I was defining myself or thinking about the historical experience of people that I knew, again, communities that I was familiar with. I always thought that there was a significant gap, and that maybe in the language of Michelle Roth-Trujillo, that there were definitely silences, major silences, and that they were incorporated systematically into the world of media representations and journalistic representations. If you look for coverage of an array of topics, and you go to the New York Times at the end of the 19th century, you will not be looking at the American record, sort of everything that's factual and needed for again, print coverage and historical representation. And I think that was a fascinating maneuver on the part of Trump in a way that he's very alert to the masses of Americans and parts of the country that, again, I just feel like that sometimes our social milieu can believe is flyover country, and parts of the U.S. that we tend to dismiss and that we don't take very seriously, and again, that do not wind up having powerful representation in the academies and in the sectors of the United States that very many of us frequent. And I think that what we absolutely must do is reclaim diverse journalistic narratives, and it's here again very fascinating the way that the Trump administration is maneuvering and creating space for the alternate right. We absolutely must have more space for the alternate left, or whatever sort of compensatory means of journalistic representation one would favor. But I think that we need more voices, and that it's going to be very important for those of us up here on the panel and in the audience to destabilize the power of the group that Bannon and Trump have identified as the opposition power, the opposition party, because there is actually, in my view, a tendentiousness and a slant and an obscurantism and a silencing that continues to take place.
Okay, we're signaling that we're going to come to the audience now. So I think you're going to, how do we want to do this? Sorry.
Just raise your hand, and then Corey will call on 3 people at a time, and you can stand up to say your question. Just project louder than I'm projecting.
And let's really keep it to questions, please, not statements. So it's at the back, yes. With the glasses, yes.
I just wanted to kind of link something that I think that Sarah and Kate said. That, Sarah, you were talking about how the younger left, or the younger resistance, too often moves away from the free speech ideals of our previous generations. And then, Kate, you brought up how so often the free speech we're seeing, especially on the internet these days, is false speech. It's bots, it's 20 accounts from one lunatic. And so I'm wondering how we as a generation are meant to stick to that idea of free speech when it's false. It's, how do we reconcile that? How do we protect that ideal while still actually, I firmly believe that some speech in this day and age does need to be silenced, actually. So Sarah, I guess, because
We're going to just try to take 3 at a time.
Oh,
so
sorry.
we can, yes, sir. Yes.
I guess my question is going back to this idea of normalcy, and I'm wondering if there's maybe a way we could think about the fact that the U.S. or this space that we're living on has never been a normal place ever since the first Europeans arrived here and the first slave ship arrived here. So, and if that could change our understanding of what is normal and this sort of thing of fascism always being there, I mean, for some people, this country's basically always been a fascist country. So I'm wondering if you respond to that. And this idea that white supremacy and the rule of law or any constitutional order is just fundamentally incompatible.
I wanted to ask 2 related questions. The general one is, with regard to history and the present, where we see the grounds for hope, where we see the grounds for building resistance, building a movement for the future. Specifically, Lawrence Jackson referred to a need for the history of slavery, where the fortunes were made, how the money traveled, and you thought that was crucially important. And since I've been writing about that for more time than I care to admit, I would love to hear specifically why you think that's important. But as a general question, where do we look for the history or the present, the grounds of resistance?
I'll start with the free speech question, and I'm not that developed, I don't have a developed answer for you, but it's something that we have to grapple with. I disagree with you. I think that we have to preserve free speech for all whenever possible. And I understand the temptations. But the problem with the movement of shutting down real fascists or people who are simply offend you is that you never know who's going to control that structure. And I can tell you that right now, that the hate speech paradigm that we have all allowed to be put in place is now being used against Palestine solidarity movements, where they're criticizing Israel with hate speech. So there you go. And that's the danger. And that's why we have to learn to live with difference, no matter how offensive, when it is spoken. The speech is not the same thing as a law, for example.
I think we're going to disagree slightly on this, and I actually think you've raised a really important point, which is that taking an extreme line on free speech, which is to say we have to protect it all at all times, I think is actually really limited in its vision. And realistically, lots of speech is not allowed already. It's just that, there are particular types of speech in a courtroom that you can't make. There are certain words you can't say on television. We're used to the idea that speech is not free. It actually comes at a very high cost. And and here's the thing: we actually have hate speech laws, and we're kind of used to the fact that if you're starting to abuse somebody because of their sexuality or their race or their religion on the street, that could actually get you into a very difficult situation. You'll probably get ticketed. That hasn't actually, eroded the foundations of democracy. I actually think in some ways it's been very powerful. But your question was even more subtle, which is that now we have these really powerful tools that can magnify forms of speech. And the fake news issue of the last election is not a joke. It's very serious. And we now have platforms that went from being ideological purists about, all speech is free, it must circulate, to suddenly realizing that they became the tools of circulating false stories that really damaged individuals' lives. We could talk about Pizzagate, right through to individual political candidates, and you could talk about Hillary there too. So I think we have to be a lot more nuanced in how we think about speech, because we're moving into an extraordinary intensification of how speech can be manipulated, and we need to be a lot smarter about it.
Just to sort of respond to the second and third questions, I would say that if we have two large goals, one being universal health care, another being universal access to college education, that the pursuit of the fortunes of enslavement are some of the best tools that we have at our disposal to be able to unravel these family fortunes and institutional fortunes, and in their unraveling, by exposing them as participants in genocide and universal Holocaust, and holding them to rule of international law, I think that those are the tangible goals that we should be pursuing in those historical genealogies of the beneficiaries of enslavement, and that possibly with the additions of universities like Brown and Georgetown, the Georgetown example to me is just, I don't mean to belittle the suffering of the descendants of the people that were sold. It just seems a farcical kind of gesture on their part. In other words, that we can with the very limited, just take a look at my father's name, and you can see the struggle that basically your average African American has to sort of get a family tree to 1870, let alone to 1860, and this idea that that they will be able to successfully parse the hairs and determine precise routes of descent, from people sold at an auction in the 1820s, I believe. Seems to me to be splitting the hairs quite finely, and also exposing the trauma, again, that is at the core of all of the antebellum American institutions, including the one and the two institutions that I've served at the longest at this point. But I think that is our road to those giant achievements for universal health care and affordable access to college education.
I'll quickly address the free speech question and then leap forward to the hope question. The right to free speech does not mean freedom to say whatever you want, whenever you want, and take money and make money off of it. which really applies to the fraudulent news on social networks and applies to paid talks on campus. Right? That's really what's being debated in these campus environments. These students are protesting speakers who are being paid by their institutions and to whom a precious resource is being allocated. The fraudulent news on social networks are monetized. Right? So we're actually, in this country, as Kate pointed out, there's nothing new about the regulation of public space, especially when it is profit-making. Radio frequencies, television frequencies, all sorts of frequencies were always allocated with very heavy regulations. But somehow we think that the internet is boundless and shouldn't be regulated in the same way, and that is not the case. Right? What's interesting to me, and this is where I lead to the whole question, is what Sarah expressed about the hate laws, and I completely agree with that part of it, and how dangerous these mechanisms are, because you never know whose hands they're going to be in, is an attitude that is traditional to the American left, an attitude of distrust toward mechanisms of the government, which is very unusual in the world, right? It's very peculiar to this country, and I've never been a particular fan of it, except that I think this is where we can draw hope now, because as a result, this country has the wealthiest, the most robust, the best, the most numerous civil society in the history of the world. And it is not in any way, or almost in any way, intertwined with the state, which makes it stand apart from any civil society anywhere in the world. We saw how it can function at its best in the reaction to the refugee ban, when sort of the entire spectrum of civil society, from protesters, spontaneous protests in the streets, to professional civil society, which is the ACLU, acted in concert as though it had been pre-planned, which it hadn't. Right? That's, if there's hope anywhere, it's there.
So I'm going to I was supposed to be a panelist originally, and I've been very insidious about it. But I do want to respond to two of the I want to take Sarah's side on this free speech question, and I think this could be just a question of where we are. We're in an institution community where the question of speech is not of objectionable speech that we're trying to shut down. I think we are what is in the much more classic free speech position at CUNY, which is that we are trying to get heterodox speech spoken and heard. And that, for the left, has always been, for most of its history, the real question. Why was the left such advocates for free speech? It was precisely because its voice was not allowed to be heard. And I do think there's a kind of historical myopia that concerns me about today's left, which is the presumption is that if the question is, do we have the right to ban the speech, the presumption is that you're in the seat of power that's in the position to do that. The left has never been in that kind of position historically in this country. It's always been a very precarious position. So I do think it's worth thinking about, even acknowledging, of course, the question that free speech has never been absolutely free. I mean, that's all part of First Amendment jurisprudence, and that's quite true. But there is an assumption, I think, that is probably historically very specific and won't last. But the other question about normality. Normals. When is when have we ever been normal? I think is a really important one. I wrote a piece in the Guardian a month and a half ago where I said I'm a student of American political repression and coercion, and what you learn from the history of American political repression and coercion is that almost all of it has happened through constitutional, legal, institutional means. These have not been extramural categories that have happened somehow in spite of the rule of law. They've oftentimes transpired through the rule of law. So one of the reasons I'm skeptical about some of the parallels that get invoked of fascism and authoritarianism is that it presumes, I think, that there are not enough tools at the disposal of the existing system to accomplish extraordinarily bad things. I mean, I especially studied quite a bit about McCarthyism, and it's shocking when you see that, we focus on this demagogic figure who was, I mean, tip of the iceberg doesn't even begin to describe what McCarthyism was about. It was a systemic institutional operation that was legitimized all the way up through the Supreme Court. So I do think, I think the question is a good one, and I mean, this is where I think history could actually help us quite a bit, as opposed to a question asked earlier. So anyway, we're going to take 3 more questions now. Yes?
Actually, my question is directed more to Kate, and it's premised on the long-standing tension between using the master's keys to liberate oneself. Here's the question. You talked about the power of tech companies and how they historically been attached to institutional power of particularly racial coercion and motive, and they would be motivated by the state to commit truly horrific actions. Especially with IBM. My question is about the what I refer to as the terrorist campaign you never heard of, Gamergate. I read a lot of articles and essays.
What about that one?
Yeah, I read about
As a
articles.
woman on the internet, I can
Exactly. Oh yeah. There's been a lot of articles and essays that have suggested that Gamergate was a bit of a precursor to the rise of the Trump phenomenon. And I think that's a story that's largely gone unremarked upon unless you read those types of journals. I'm not a computer geek at all. I comment on the guy's blog posts. That's basically where my limits are, So the question is, what can one do and how can one understand the capacity for the fascist project when you have people like Yiannopoulos, the Gamergators, and the willingness and capacity of major tech companies to basically act as an extension of the arm of the government to oppress and disappear people a la Hannah Arendt's image. What's one to do there? How do you understand
2 more questions?
Beautifully put. We'll take the other 2 with
Yes.
Hi. So earlier there was a little bit of a discussion, some with reference to Arendt, about evil as being a small or a banal thing. And I wonder if some of the issue is like precisely the opposite, that evil tends to be minimized and made banal. And part of this is to ask whether some of the invocations about protecting civil society, protecting the public sphere, or the media, or these different realms actually serve to protect evils which have historically been minimized or made small. And I mean, we could look to some of Sarah's work, for example, to see the ways that the public sphere has plagued and bedeviled queer people over the last 30 years. We could look to some of Lawrence's work to see the ways in which the exact same public sphere has functioned at the exclusion of many African Americans. And I just wonder if, like, thinking about these historical institutions as things worthy of praise at this moment, like, risks also limiting what our options are for popular resistance. Whether that, in spite of the statements that you've made, does funnel us back into a civil democratic model that leads us to the Democratic Party, and whether that leads us to be skeptical of some of the more grassroots, more militant, more protest, or even riot-driven methods of attacking the present political conjuncture.
Great, thank you. Yes, sir. There's so many people. The jean jacket. Sorry.
My question is actually very much related to those 2. I mean, as a journalist, I would love to think of myself as a guardian of the public sphere. That sounds very grand. Facebook is a super fun site. Twitter is a wasteland populated by reporters like me and like neo-Nazis. Newspapers are already dying. Magazines are dropping like flies. Like, I guess my question is, when we're talking about the public sphere now, today, what actually are we talking about? Because I don't know. I don't have a working definition of what that means. And it's been bandied about by everyone, and so I just wonder if maybe this is a very basic question, but like, could you explain what that means to you?
Okay, so that was, I'm afraid, the last question, so this is going to be your last chance to weigh in on the discussion.
Only
So,
the biggest possible questions, so we're going to bring off to the end of the night.
and quickly too. So.
Yeah. All right, high speed. to respond to your question, you essentially outlined the thing that keeps me up at night and that defines the work that I do, which is that I actually think we don't have a good answer to dealing with the extraordinary concentration of power that we see represented by the technology companies that is only going to become stronger in the next 10 years as we see artificial intelligence filter into every social institution that we've discussed today, from criminal justice to journalism to health to education. The issue of Gamergate, I think, is one of the ones that we should look at to see how marginalized speech becomes mainstreamed. And I would note that there is a fantastic piece written by Gabriella Coleman, who of course has done a lot of research into everything from Anonymous to a whole range of trolling communities, to say we give them an awful lot of credit. I don't think they are by any means the group that brought us here, but they were mobilized in particular ways by far more powerful entities. And I think that is the key question now, is that we have to look at how we analyze power, because it is shifting in ways that are extraordinarily different to the norm, and I think this is where we do break from history. We're seeing an intensification in spaces that are very opaque, that have very little transparency. And to tie it back to your question about the public sphere, I think we're seeing a fracturing of the public sphere unlike anything that we've seen before. To be clear, I'm not a Habermasian. I don't believe we ever had a perfect public sphere. We had a lovely elite public sphere for a while there, but it was only a bubble in time. But now even that, I think, has quite seriously burst. And what we have is a series of very niche, small pockets of conversation that are completely convinced of their own rightness. And that is a real worry to me, because what we have is a situation that I think traditional liberal democratic principles are unused to contending with. I think we have to come up with a far more radical way of understanding what a public is in a time like this.
Unfortunately, I don't know what Gamergate is, so I'm
I'll horrify you later.
You'll hide under your bed after you hear it.
I would just maybe leave you with two words or concepts. So one is Maroon Society. I've been sort of having a crisis of conscience up here on the panel. I feel like I'm going to have to go back to my roots. But that, in other words, there would be bodies of insurgency that would continue, and that there would be moments of, we talked about collaboration, which I, again, see part of my collaboration as being in the Western Hemisphere on the North American territorial space, right? I am already involved in collaboration, but that the Maroon Societies would enable us to preserve something what maybe Cordell West would call the nurturing subculture of difference, that there would be something there that could be ongoing and quite useful, and that would operate in an insurgent fashion. And that also, I'm sorry, there was another point that I wanted to make about the discourse, but I don't want to keep talking.
So define the public sphere, and
50 words or less.
yeah, I also don't think we ever had a perfect public sphere, but at the same time, I'm not quite as pessimistic as Kate is, and I think it's important to not fall into the very easy the trap of saying, oh, we are just, we have the right-wing bubble and the liberal bubble, or however people are phrasing it. Because actually that I think is a false equivalence. I think that there's some terrific stuff that people have done, including, for example, BuzzFeed did the simplest story in the world that no one else thought of doing, which was analyze Trump's tweets over the course of 18 months to see where he was getting his news, and came up with this beautiful chart that showed that he was living inside a Breitbart bubble. Now, the difference between that is that, and there have been other studies that have shown this sort of in a wider context, people who read Breitbart by and large are in fact living in a bubble. There are people who are never exposed, or almost never exposed, to people with views that are any different from theirs. If you so much as read the New York Times, you're actually exposed to a fairly wide spectrum of political views, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. You know, it's not a boundless spectrum. Right? It doesn't include some views that it should include, and perhaps it includes views that I don't think it should include. But you will be exposed to views that you don't share, and you will get answers to questions you didn't ask. That's what the public sphere is. It's where you get answers to questions that you don't ask. The moment that stops for you, that's when you're living in a bubble. I think that would be out of
Yeah,
time.
I'm sorry, we have one more speaker,
I'll
I'm
give
sorry.
you my time. Go ahead, ask your question.
From the south hemisphere here, and I want to ask you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay, so to the man next to you, you said something about civil resistance in this country being the greatest, first, define the criteria, because it sounds preposterous to me. Coming from a place where there have been a lot of resistance and where people actually died for resistance.
I said civil society.
It's the same.
No, it's not the same at all. No, civil society is.
What's the criteria for that?
Sorry?
Okay,
Okay.
just let's, okay, so let's have a response and then we can.
Right. Civil society is that which is not commercial and not government. Right. This country has the richest, largest civil society in the world. We can differ in definitions, but if you accept my definition for the sake of argument, there's no argument that it is the biggest thing of that kind that's ever existed.
Okay, thank you. So Sarah, do you want to, we have 5 minutes.
Oh, okay, I was gonna say, don't look for everyone to rise together. There's incredible leadership coming out every day, and it's coming from all different corners, and we all have to feel it, we all should feel that we have responsibility to act in the way that we feel we must. So for example, we're looking at leaders like Linda Sarsour, who's emerged, a Palestinian Muslim woman who is pro-choice, who's pro-queer, who supports Black Lives Matter, who's emerged as a woman's leader in this country. Or Andrea Bernstein from NYC, who did that incredible story yesterday about Manafort using New York City real estate for money laundering, and you start to realize that when we have tens of thousands of homeless people that we don't even have room for in shelters, because 30% of our cash-only upscale real estate is being used for money laundering. I mean, bless her, that she produced that piece of information. So, let's all try to strive to, as they used to say in the old days, live like them, and make our mark. Thank you.
So on that note, I want to thank all of our panelists for a lively discussion. I want to thank all of you for your questions. And soldier on. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. So we have books by both panel. If you'd like one, you may get a sign up here and pay for it upstairs. Thank you so much.
How are you feeling? Is that Oh, you're going? You're going to work? Okay. I'll see you later. No, go ahead.
That was, whoops, sorry.
Good job.
Oh, fantastic.
Yep, yeah. It's a great venue. few more, probably more.
Well, thank you so much. That is wonderful. Nice to hear. Thank you. Thanks for coming in. That's a good one.
We sold out Town Hall back in the day.
Oh, but I'm saying in very recent times.
Well, actually, no.
The Zadie Smith event that we did at NYU was packed in
I was going to say delicatessen on the corner of the These are like, I think that's a lounge bar. Oh, we can go scout it out first.
Yeah, let me see if